The vampire laughed. The coffin struck such a chord of terror in me, I think it absorbed all the capacity for terror I had left. Then came only my mild alarm at having to share a coffin with Lestat. He was in his father's bedroom, meantime, telling the old man goodbye, that he would return in the morning. "But where do you go? Why must you live by such a schedule?" the old man demanded, and Lestat became impatient. Before this, he'd been gracious to the old man, almost to the point of sickening one, but now he became a bully. "I take care of you, don't I? I've put a better roof over your head than you ever put over mine. If I want to sleep all day and drink all night, I'll do it, damn you." The old man started to whine. Only my peculiar state of emotions and most unusual feeling of exhaustion kept me from disapproving. I was watching the scene through the open door, enthralled with the colors of the counterpane and the positive riot of color in the old man's face. His blue veins pulsed beneath his pink and grayish flesh. I found even the yellow of his teeth appealing to me, and I became almost hypnotized by the quivering of his lip. "Such a son! Such a son!" he said, never suspecting, of course, the true nature of his son. "All right, then. Go. I know you keep a woman somewhere. You go to see her as soon as her husband leaves in the morning. Give me a rosary. What's happened to my rosary?" Lestat said something blasphemous and gave him the rosary. "But," the boy started. "Yes," said the vampire. "I'm afraid I don't allow you to ask enough questions." I was going to ask, rosaries have crosses on them, don't they?" "Oh, the rumor of crosses," the vampire laughed. "You refer to our being afraid of crosses." Unable to look on them, I thought," said the boy. "Nonsense, my friend. Sheer nonsense. I can look on anything I like, and I rather like looking on crucifixes in particular. And what about the rumor about keyholes, that you can become steam and go through them?" "I wish I could," laughed the vampire. "How positively delightful. I should like to pass through all manner of different keyholes and feel the tickle of their peculiar shapes." "No," he shook his head. "That is how you would say today. Bullshit." The boy laughed despite himself. Then his face grew serious. "You mustn't be so shy with me," the vampire said. "What is it?" The story about stakes through the heart," said the boy, his cheeks coloring slightly. "The same," said the vampire. "Bullshit," he said, carefully articulating both syllables so that the boy smiled. "No magical power whatsoever. Why don't you smoke one of your cigarettes? I see you have them in your shirt pocket." "Oh, thank you," the boy said, as if it were a marvelous suggestion. But once he had the cigarette to his lips, his hands were trembling so badly that he mangled the first fragile book match. "Allow me," said the vampire, and taking the book, he quickly put a lighted match to the boy's cigarette. The boy inhaled, his eyes on the vampire's fingers. Now the vampire withdrew across the table with a soft rustling of garments. "There's an ashtray on the basin," he said, and the boy moved nervously to get it. He stared at the few butts in it for a moment, and then, seeing the small basket beneath, he emptied the ashtray and quickly set it on the table. His fingers left damp marks on the cigarette when he put it down. "Is this your room?" he asked. "No," answered the vampire. "Just a room." "What happened then?" the boy asked. The vampire appeared to be watching the smoke gather beneath the overhead bulb. We went back to New Orleans post-haste," he said. "Lestat had his coffin in a miserable room near the ramparts." "And you did get into the coffin?" "I had no choice. I begged Lestat to let me stay in the closet, but he laughed, astonished. "Don't you know what you are?" he asked. "But is it magical? Must it have this shape?" I pleaded, only to hear him laugh again. I couldn't bear the idea, but as we argued, I realized I had no real fear. It was a strange realization. All my life I'd feared closed places, born and bred in French houses with lofty ceilings and floor-length windows. I had a dread of being enclosed. I felt uncomfortable even in the confessional in church. It was a normal enough fear, and now I realized as I protested to Lestat, I did not actually feel this anymore. I was simply remembering it, hanging on to it from habit, from a deficiency of ability to recognize my present and exhilarating freedom. "You're carrying on badly," Lestat said finally, "and it's almost dawn. I should let you die. You will die, you know. The sun will destroy the blood I've given you, in every tissue, every vein. But you shouldn't be feeling this fear at all. I think you're like a man who loses an arm or a leg and keeps insisting that he can feel pain where the arm or leg used to be." Well, that was positively the most intelligent and useful thing Lestat ever said in my presence, and it brought me around at once. "Now I'm getting into the coffin," he finally said to me in his most disdainful tone, "and you will get in on top of me if you know what's good for you." And I did. I lay face down on him, utterly confused by my absence of dread, and filled with a distaste for being so close to him, handsome and intriguing though he was, and he shut the lid. Then I asked him if I was completely dead. My body was tingling and itching all over. "No, you're not then," he said. "When you are, you'll only hear and see it changing, and feel nothing. You should be dead by tonight. Go to sleep." Was he right? Were you dead when you woke up? Yes. Changed, I should say, as obviously I am alive. My body was dead. It was some time before it became absolutely cleansed of the fluids and matter it no longer needed, but it was dead, and with the realization of it came another stage in my divorce from human emotions. The first thing which became apparent to me, even while Lestat and I were loading the coffin into a hearse and stealing another coffin from a mortuary, was that I did not like Lestat at all. I was far from being his equal yet, but I was infinitely closer to him than I had been before the death of my body. I can't really make this clear to you for the obvious reason that you are now as I was before my body died. You cannot understand. But before I died, Lestat was absolutely the most overwhelming experience I'd ever had. Your cigarette has become one long cylindrical ash. Oh, the boy quickly ground the filter into the glass. You mean that when the gap was closed between you, he lost his spell? He asked, his eyes quickly fixed on the vampire, his hands now producing a cigarette and match much more easily than before. Yes, that's correct, said the vampire with obvious pleasure. The trip back to Point du Lac was thrilling, and the constant chatter of Lestat was positively the most boring and disheartening thing I experienced. Of course, as I said, I was far from being his equal. I had my dead limbs to contend with, to use his comparison, and I learned that on that very night, when I had to make my first kill. The vampire reached across the table now and gently brushed an ash from the boy's lapel, and the boy stared at his withdrawing hand in alarm. "Excuse me," said the vampire. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Excuse me," said the boy. "I just got the impression suddenly that your arm was abnormally long. You reached so far without moving." "No," said the vampire, resting his hands again on his crossed knees. "I moved forward much too fast for you to see. It was an illusion." You moved forward, but you didn't. You're sitting just as you are now, with your back against the chair." "No," repeated the vampire firmly. "I moved forward as I told you. Here, I'll do it again." And he did it again, and the boy stared with the same mixture of confusion and fear. "You still didn't see it," said the vampire. "But you see, if you look at my outstretched arm now, It's really not remarkably long at all." And he raised his arm, first finger pointing heavenwards, as if it were an angel about to give the word of the Lord. "You have experienced a fundamental difference between the way you and I see. My gesture appeared slow and somewhat languid to me, and the sound of my finger brushing your coat was quite audible. Well, I didn't mean to frighten you, I confess, but perhaps you can see from this that my return to Point du Lac was a feast of new experiences. The mere swaying of a tree branch in the wind, a delight." "Yes," said the boy, but he was still visibly shaken. The vampire eyed him for a moment, and then he said, I was telling you." "About your first kill," said the boy. "Yes. I should say first, however, that the plantation... Yes. I should say first, however, that the plantation was in a state of pandemonium. The overseer's body had been found, and so had the blind old man in the master bedroom, and no one could explain the blind old man's presence, and no one had been able to find me in New Orleans. My sister had contacted the police, and several of them were at Point du Lac when I arrived. It was already quite dark, naturally, and Lestat quickly explained to me that I must not let the police see me in even minimal light, especially not with my body in its present remarkable state. So I talked to them in the avenue of oaks before the plantation house, ignoring their requests that we go inside. I explained I'd been to Point du Lac the night before, and the blind old man was my guest. As for the overseer, he had not been here, but he had gone to New Orleans on business. After that was settled, during which my new detachment served me admirably, I had the problem of the plantation itself. My slaves were in a state of complete confusion, and no work had been done all day. We had a large plant then for the making of the indigo dye, and the overseer's management had been most important. But I had several extremely intelligent slaves who might have done his job just as well a long time before, if I had recognized their intelligence and not feared their African appearance and manner. I studied them clearly now and gave the management of things over to them. To the best, I gave the overseer's house on a promise. 2 of the young women were brought back into the house from the fields to care for Lestat's father, and I told them I wanted as much privacy as possible, and they would all of them be rewarded, not only for service, but for leaving me at Lestat absolutely alone. I did not realize at the time that these slaves would be the first, and possibly the only ones to ever suspect that Lestat and I were not ordinary creatures. I failed to realize that their experiences with the supernatural was far greater than that of white men. In my own inexperience, I still thought of them as childlike savages barely domesticated by slavery. I made a bad mistake. But let me keep to my story. I was going to tell you about my first kill. Lestat bungled it with his characteristic lack of common sense. "Bungled it?" asked the boy. "I should never have started with human beings, but this was something I had to learn by myself. Lestat had us plunge headlong into the swamps right after the police and the slaves were settled. It was very late, and the slave cabins were completely dark. We soon lost sight of the lights of Point du Lac altogether, and I became very agitated. It was the same thing again, remembered fears, confusion. Lestat, had he any native intelligence, might have explained things to me patiently and gently, that I had no need to fear the swamps, that to snakes and insects I was utterly invulnerable, and that I must concentrate on my new ability to see in total darkness. Instead, he harassed me with condemnations. He was concerned only with our victims, with finishing my initiation and getting on with it. And when we finally came upon our victims, he rushed me into action. They were a small camp of runaway slaves. Lestat had visited them before and picked off perhaps a fourth of their number by watching from the dark for one of them to leave the fire, or by taking them in their sleep. They knew absolutely nothing of Lestat's presence. We had to watch for well over an hour before one of the men, they were all men, finally left the clearing and came just a few paces into the trees. He unhooked his pants now and attended to an ordinary physical necessity. And as he turned to go, Lestat shook me and said, "Take him." The vampire smiled at the boy's wide eyes. "I think I was about as horror-struck as you would be," he said. "But I didn't know then that I might kill animals instead of humans." I said quickly I could not possibly take him, and the slave heard me speak. He turned, his back to the distant fire, and peered into the dark. Then, quickly and silently, he drew a long knife out of his belt. He was naked except for the pants and the belt, a tall, strong-armed, sleek young man. He said something in the French patois, and then he stepped forward. I realized that, though I saw him clearly in the dark, he could not see us. Lestat stepped in back of him with a swiftness that baffled me, and got a hold around his neck while he pinned his left arm. The slave cried out and tried to throw Lestat off. He sank his teeth now, and the slave froze as if from snakebite. He sank to his knees, and Lestat fed fast as the other slaves came running. "You sicken me," he said when he got back to me. It was as if we were black insects utterly camouflaged in the night, watching the slaves move, oblivious to us, discover the wounded man, drag him back, fan out in the foliage, searching for the attacker. "Come on, we have to get another one before they all return to camp," he said, and quickly we set off after one man who was separated from the others. I was still terribly agitated, convinced I couldn't bring myself to attack, and feeling no urge to do so. There were many things, as I mentioned, which Lestat might have said and done. He might have made the experience rich in so many ways, but he did not. "What could he have done?" the boy asked. "What do you mean?" "Killing is no ordinary act," said the vampire. "One doesn't simply glut oneself on blood." He shook his head. "It is the experience of another, life for certain, and often the experience of the loss of that life through the blood, slowly. It is again and again the experience of that loss of my own life, which I experienced when I sucked the blood from Lestat's wrist and felt his heart pound within my heart. It is again and again a celebration of that experience, because for vampires, that is the ultimate experience." He said this more seriously, as if he were arguing with someone who held a different view. I don't think Lestat ever appreciated that, though how could he not? I don't know. Let me say he appreciated something, but very little, I think, of what there is to know. In any event, he took no pains to remind me now of what I'd felt when I clamped onto his wrist for life itself and wouldn't let go, or to pick and choose a place for me where I might experience my first kill with some measure of quiet and dignity. He rushed headlong through the encounter, as if it were something to put behind us as quickly as possible, like so many yards of the road. Once he had caught the slave, he gagged him and held him, baring his neck. "Do it," he said. "You can't turn back now." Overcome with revulsion and weak with frustration, I obeyed. I knelt beside the bent, struggling man. I knelt beside the bent, struggling man, and, clamping both my hands on his shoulders, I went into his neck. My teeth had only just begun to change, and I had to tear his flesh, not puncture it. But once the wound was made, the blood flowed, and once that happened, once I was locked to it, drinking, all else vanished. Lestat and the swamp and the noise of the distant camp meant nothing. Lestat might have been an insect buzzing, lighting, then vanishing in significance. The sucking mesmerized me. The warm struggling of the man was soothing to the tension of my hands, and there came the beating of the drum again, which was the drumbeat of his heart. Only this time it beat in perfect rhythm with the drumbeat of my own heart, the two resounding in every fiber of my being, until the beat began to grow slower and slower. so that each was a soft rumble that threatened to go on without end. I was drowning, falling into weightlessness, and then Lestat pulled me back. "He's dead, you idiot," he said with his characteristic charm and tact. "You don't drink after they're dead. Understand that?" I was in a frenzy for a moment, not myself, insisting to him that the man's heart still beat, and I was in an agony to clamp onto him again. I ran my hands over his chest, then grabbed at his wrists. I would have cut into his wrists if Lestat hadn't pulled me to my feet and slapped my face. This slap was astonishing. It was not painful in the ordinary way. It was a sensational shock of another sort, a rapping of the senses so that I spun in confusion and found myself helpless and staring back. My back against a cypress, the night pulsing with insects in my ears. "You'll die if you do that," Lestat was saying. "He'll suck you right down into death with him if you cling to him in death. And now you've drunk too much. Besides, you'll be ill." His voice grated on me. I had the urge to throw myself on him suddenly, but I was feeling just what he'd said. There was a grinding pain in my stomach, as if some whirlpool there were sucking my insides into itself. It was the blood passing too rapidly into my own blood, but I didn't know it. Lestat moved through the night now like a cat, and I followed him, my head throbbing. The pain in my stomach no better when we reached the house of Point du Lac. As we sat at the table in the parlour, Lestat dealing a game of solitaire on the polished wood, I sat there staring at him with contempt. He was mumbling nonsense. I would get used to killing, he said. It would be nothing. I must not allow myself to be shaken. I was reacting too much, as if the mortal coil had not been shaken off. I would become accustomed to things all too quickly. Do you think so? I asked him finally. I really had no interest in his answer. I understood now the difference between us. For me, the experience of killing had been cataclysmic. So had that sucking of Lestat's wrist. These experiences so overwhelmed and so changed my view of everything around me, from the picture of my brother on the parlour wall to the sight of a single star in the topmost pane of the French window, that I could not imagine another vampire taking them for granted. I was altered permanently. I knew it. And what I felt most profoundly for everything, even the sound of the playing cards being laid one by one upon the shining rows of their solitaire, was respect. Lestat felt the opposite, or he felt nothing. He was the sow's ear out of which nothing fine could be made, as boring as a mortal, as trivial and unhappy as a mortal. He chattered over the game, belittling my experience, utterly locked against the possibility of any experience of his own. By morning I realized that I was his complete superior, and I had been sadly cheated in having him for a teacher. He must guide me through the necessary lessons, if there were any more real lessons, and I must tolerate him in a frame of mind which was blasphemous to life itself. I felt cold towards him. I had no contempt in superiority, only a hunger for new experience, and that which was beautiful and devastating as my kill. And I saw that if I were to maximize every experience available to me, I must exert my own powers over my learning. Lestat was of no use. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, so that is the next 10 pages of Interview with the Vampire, and we have got a lot of stuff to unpack today, so we'll get right into it. First things first, we have a breaking down of traditional vampire myths discussed between the interviewer and Louis. The notion of crosses, keyholes, etc., where all of these things, all of these preconceptions the boy has about vampires are dismantled and thrown out the window. Louis goes so far as to directly just call them bullshit. Vampires don't work. the way this boy has been culturally led to believe they work. There are a couple of implications to this. First off, the crosses one is pretty self-explanatory, I think, tying further into that notion of a crisis of faith and secularism throughout the text. There is a moment later into the novel which I think really, really highlights this, so I'll save most of my analysis for that regarding when we get to that point. But just for now, I think it's pretty self-explanatory with the fact that, Lestat picks up a rosary, looks at the cross. Louis likes to look at crucifixes. They are ineffectual. They don't have any true power behind them in this depiction. And that's the kind of secular outlook that the book is trying to get across. The notion that God, if he exists, he isn't exerting influence in this world at all. And it's only really the evil supernatural forces that get to exert any true power. But this general dispelling of myths, because it's not just the crucifixes that get thrown out as bullshit, stakes and keyholes also get thrown out. There's some significance behind that, I think. And I think in that you need to look at it in the context of its publication in 1976. There's a trope at this stage that people, bring out whenever a new vampire story is published, which is our vampires are different. The notion that every single vampire story that's published has to put some spin on the vampire, where it's like, no, but our vampires don't work in the exact same way as all the other vampires. There's something unique about them, and this is how vampires really are. And I think you see that very directly put in place with this, where Anne Rice, in writing Interview, very actively takes some of the iconic vampire tropes and just throws them out the window in an intentional subversion. And I think what this really says in this regard is it kind of tells the reader this is going to be a vampire story like none you've ever really experienced before. And it is. It's a vampire story that, especially in the context of its publication, turns the entire creature on its head. It takes this creature of the night and throws a lot of its core tropes just out the window, calls them bullshit. And in a story that is about the vampire's perspective on issues, I think it's very fitting that the story kind of highlights its subversion of the entire genre by throwing out some of its typical expectations, so that the reader is also kind of expected to throw out all their expectations, basically telling you anything can happen. These ain't your granddad's vampires, basically. But there's one trope that keeps. Well, there's the sunlight, and we'll talk about the sunlight later. But the coffin. Why does the coffin stay? Why is it that Lestat insists Louis has to sleep in a coffin with him? Well, we talked a bit about that in the last part in regards to this kind of sexual manipulation on behalf of Lestat. And it gets even more menacing towards the start of what we read today. It sounds really rapey, the way Lestat talks to Louis. And there are a lot of parallels in the dynamic between Louis and Lestat in this kind of sexual predation and an abusive relationship between the two characters. And I think you see that highlighted very well in that coffin interaction. But the coffin is interesting because I'll try not to draw the later texts in the Vampire Chronicles into this. One, because I haven't read all of them, because there's a lot of them. And two, because I think Interview with the Vampire is kind of fun to look at as its own contained story. Not discounting the later text, but it's fun on its own. In the later texts, it turns out the coffins just completely aren't necessary. You just need to stay out of the sunlight. So let's assume coffins aren't necessary in the world of Interview. Why is it that Lestat wants Louis to sleep in a coffin? I think, personally, it's another extension of that notion of traumatic bonding. This creation of a trauma within Louis that will further tie him to Lestat, where if he undergoes all of these traumatic experiences, he'll become dependent on Lestat, because Lestat is, in a way, perhaps the only one who can protect him, or the only one who understands. And I think understanding and knowledge about vampires is one of the things Lestat holds over Louis the most throughout this text, and we'll talk about that more as it comes up. But moving on, we've got another thing to talk about in these 10 pages, and this is a bit of a doozy, because it's the depiction of the slaves, and oh boy. So, let's get it out of the way to begin with. Louis is a racist. He's less of a racist in the modern time period, but he's still pretty racist. And I don't think saying he's of that time is good enough as kind of a discounting of his views. Because sure, he's from a time period where, like, in polite society, it would be more acceptable to hold racist views. That doesn't mean it's okay from our perspective to look on his moral values and go, that's great, especially when he's depicted as a immortal creature that transcends these time periods and is in our modern world. So we're looking at his antiquated views in our modern world. And I guess, like, one of the things that we look at is the book almost tries to play it off like he's not racist anymore. And it does this by pointing out that, like, he talks about their kind of superstitiousness as a great virtue that was what allowed them to identify his vampiric nature. There's that very iffy paragraph where he's like, they weren't reined in like white men were, or whatever the specific was, but it's very explicit. And this is where the book being published in the 70s really shows its colors, I suppose. But this notion that even the kind of more modernized Louis looks back and attributes the identification of his vampirism, his and Lestat's vampirism, to the superstitious savagery of his slaves, is nonsensical. Because I think with the way Lestat and Louis were behaving, anyone would identify that something was wrong. And I mean, there's an element of it trying to make a point about, like, really rational, like, rationalism, science, like, blinding people to supernatural, kind of like what happens in Dracula. But it's so on the nose that it kind of falls apart, I think. And I think that this depiction of the slaves as it being, because of their uncivilized, quote-unquote, nature, they're able to identify the vampire. It's a bit of an iffy and kind of harmful depiction, where it's this notion that, they're trapped in this, like, undeveloped state, and that's why they're able to see these it's kind of this noble, savage notion in regards to dealing with the supernatural. It's really iffy, and I don't like it, and there are people far more qualified to talk about it than me, but that's just a general overview of what I think of it. One of the things interesting we see from the slaves themselves is I think we see a pretty good example of sly civility in action. The kind of post-colonial notion where one of the ways that people who are, subjugated by colonial regimes, in this case the slaves, are able to handle the subjugation on them is by this sly civility, this technical servitude to a regime, but trying to undermine it from within, doing everything they can to just go against it and not, aid in their own subjugation, essentially. And we see that with the way these slaves that Louis promotes, acting like he's doing them a great favor, and he's recognizing their intelligence by promoting them to a higher rank of slave, so that, like, just because they're smart slaves, they get to be, like, slightly less enslaved. It's it's all nonsensical, and he looks back on this like it was a really smart thing of him to do, which in reality it's just him being a slave owner and a bad person. But the slaves, the ones that he promotes to kind of look over the place in place of the overseer, and again I'm like, why did the overseer need to go? Surely there was a better way to do this. But they recognize that he's a vampire, in my opinion, probably because of all the corpses Lestat's been leaving around the place, rather than anything else. And they start to work against him from within that. And we're going to see that come to a head within the next, few pages, over the next period of time, probably next few parts, which I think is cool. Another point on the slaves. I think Louis's first feeding instance, is a really interesting scene. Because I think Louis feeding upon the slave that Lestat catches symbolizes Louis's entire dynamic with those slaves. Because he expresses this vague horror at the time, but he still goes ahead with it. He doesn't really care. He's just playing along. But when we get into what he's looking back on, it really just epitomizes this notion of the slaves as nothing but a resource for him. When Louis looks back on his first kill, he doesn't focus on the humanity of his victim. He doesn't at all focus on how bad he felt about what he was doing, how horrible his action was. He mentions it so briefly, and he really just glosses over it, to the point where I don't really buy his unwillingness in this regard. What he really focuses on, what he spends a lot of time bemoaning, is how the kill was spoiled for him. What a narcissistic notion. What a slimy, horrible thing to think. This notion that he has gone out and he has killed and drained someone, and then he's concerned about how it wasn't ideal for him, how Lestat was unfair to him. We see Louis basically abandon his humanity in this regard. He abandons this common humanity that he shares with this slave. And he's just unwilling to recognize this slave as anything more than a resource. And this is one of the points where we see that modern Louis, and in all honesty, Louis probably most of the time, never really cared about these slaves he never saw these slaves as human in any regard. And he's just willing to view them as resources. Because we'll talk about feeding on animals in a little bit, but also some of the other kills that Louis performs in this novel, he is much more upset about, even in his modernized state, where he supposedly lost his humanity entirely, which is just nonsensical. But yeah, it's a moment that epitomizes Louis's relationship with these slaves, because in becoming a vampire, he performs a physical act of feeding, which is representative of the draining of life and freedom and labor from these slaves that he had been engaging in his mortal life as a slave owner. So even in death, he's performing this draining, except in a more literal sense. Yeah, that's a very broad overview of that issue, but it had to be said, because I don't think the slaves are particularly well depicted, but I think there are some interesting moments, like Louis's first kill. So, the very end, we have a moment where Louis realizes he needs to get away from Lestat. But more than that, as I've said previously, Louis is starting to behave more like Lestat. He's taken up this mantle of a vampire surprisingly well. He's going to spend the rest of the novel moaning about his humanity, but he is shockingly willing to just go along with these horrible acts. He's shockingly willing to just look back on them in retrospect and talk about how they could have been done better, not in a moral sense, but in a sense of his enjoyment. And what are the implications of this? I think first off, there's an obvious implication if we look at Lestat and Louis as this archetype of an abusive relationship, where you've got this notion of a cycle of abuse going on, where Lestat is abusive to Louis, and as a result, Louis is then only able to really fulfill himself and feel powerful, I suppose, by going on to be abusive in turn. But there's also this notion of vampiric elitism, with vampires viewing themselves as this kind of uber class, this like social class and basically racial group above all else. And anyone who is initiated into this class seems to very, very quickly take on its mantle. We've already gone on for quite a while with the analysis here, and there is a better point in the novel to talk about this notion of vampiric elitism when Claudia gets introduced. But just keep in mind that it seems like Louis is very quickly taking on this mantle of vampirism. He's very quickly taking on the benefits of the vampiric system that he's been brought into by Lestat. And he's not really showing many tangible concerns about what he's doing, no matter how much whining he may go about over the course of the novel. And we'll address that as it comes up. But anyway, that's been a longer than usual analysis segment, but it had to be done, and I hope there's some useful stuff somewhere in that from that very, very rambly and all over the place analysis. I hope you enjoyed that part, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more of Interview with the Vampire. So I'll see you then.